Welcome. My name is Elizabeth. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm really glad you're here. Today, I have another true crime story. This one is about a cyber stalking case, and it's really about psychological terror, that all encompassing, can't even think about anything else, worry that affects a person's mental, physical, and overall well being. This case takes place in the early 2000s when the internet was new, a time when technology had moved forward in a way that the laws were trying to catch up. And that's how humans learn en masse. We discover that someone would actually cross a line that is completely morally repugnant, and only then do we know to make a rule against it. So laws are, because of that, always a step behind. This case is the story of the cyber stalking of Susan Fensten. Now, this story has so many intricate details that I'm only going to be able to give like broad strokes of the story. What I suggest is that you go listen to the podcast, even if it means clicking off of this video right here and going and listening to the podcast. It's called Dear Cousin by Susan Feinstein. It's going to be the very top thing that I put in the description below. And podcasts are free, so I don't feel like I'm suggesting you do something that will cost you money. So seriously, listen to it. You get to hear the story from Susan's own voice. So when she says me and my, she really means me and my. And she actually has the FBI agent that helped her, his voice, his interview, and the federal prosecutor, his voice, his interview, describing their personal involvements with the case. She has experts as well, but it's really the fact that you can hear her tell the story that is remarkable. So I listened to the podcast and then I read her book, and the book is called You Have a Very Soft Voice, Susan, A Shocking True Story of Internet Stalking. If you can check out her book, I highly recommend it. But again, the podcast is what's free. The Kindle book is less than $7. But again, I'm not going to push anyone to spend money. But seriously, it's amazing. This is not sponsored in any way, but go check out the podcast. It is amazing. However, if you're still here and interested in like an overview of the case, then join me for the ride. Okay, this story contains discussions of kidnapping, murder, cannibalism, and fetishism. Is that a word? I think so. It concerns internet stalking and psychological terror. Okay, here we go. Susan Feinstein was born in 1962 in New York City to a 24-year-old actor father and a 19-year-old fashion student mom. The couple already had a 1-year-old daughter named Ilya. The marriage was pretty much already unraveling by the time Susan was born. They had moved from apartment to apartment, just like outrunning the landlord, collecting the rent kind of childhood. Meanwhile, her father would go missing for days or weeks at a time. Sometimes he'd be gone so long that he was actually spending some time in a mental institution. And by the time Susan was 4, her mother had had quite enough of her father. So it wouldn't be until Susan was 12 when she went to see Gone with the Wind, but couldn't get entrance because as a 12-year-old without a parent, she couldn't get in. So she walked to the corner of the street of the movie theater was on and recognized immediately that the man standing there on the corner was her father. And she had to introduce herself to him. She had to introduce herself to her father. Wow. Talk about trauma. And she says that after the, how's your sister and how's your mom questions, there was like nothing else to talk about. So she just sort of continued on her way. She wouldn't see him again until she was 21. And afterwards, she would reflect that she was glad she forced him to deal with the fact that she exists. Like her existence was forced upon him by her. And I think that's awesome. Seriously, like, you go, girl. So when Susan was 19, she moved out of her mom's place and started working and painting. She was one of those, artist styles, so she could like get a job so that she could pay her life and be able to have the time and space to paint. So she would meet her friend Bobby Ironside in 1986. They shared a love of campy old horror movies, and as with most of the gay men that Susan had become friendly with, she felt very safe with him. They ended up living across the street from one another and grew pretty close over time. His interests were much darker than hers, but as he fell sort of further and further into the S&M and kink worlds, they drifted apart. Susan was married by this time, and the two were just sort of into different things. Susan's sister had been living in the Hells Angels clubhouse off and on for years. She had been deep into hardcore drugs until she got pregnant, and then she stopped everything cold because all of a sudden the importance was the child inside her and no longer worrying about herself, which she wasn't clearly worried about. So Susan and Ilya would grow close in a way that they never had in their lives together. Susan and Ilya would grow closer than they'd ever been before. And when Anthony, Ilya's baby, was born, the two got even closer. To Susan, they were sisters again, and her joy at that could not be explained in a way that anyone could really understand. Only Susan understood this joy. And that was great until Ilya started using again. And one night when Anthony was 5 months old, after a fight with Anthony's father, Ilya would write a unalive note and then shoot herself in the head next to her baby in his crib. When Susan got home that evening, her friend said that her sister had been trying to call her all day, so she called Ilya's house, and the phone was picked up by a police officer. When Susan identified herself as Ilya's sister, the police officer said, "Your sister's dead. You need to come down here and ID her body." Understandably, Susan was completely distraught. She ran across the street to her friend Bobby's apartment, knowing that he had a phone. She had used a payphone on the street to call her sister. And he was having a party, but he let her into the house and or in the apartment, took her to the back room where it was a little quieter and let her use the phone. She called her mother and told her about Ilya. Her mom completely broke down, totally understandably. At the beginning of 2001, Susan was living in Brooklyn in a first-floor rundown apartment that she loved. The internet was just kicking off, and Susan had received an email from her old friend, Bobby, who she hadn't spoken to in about 10 years. He asked if she remembered him, and when she assured him that of course she did, he told her that he had moved to D.C. in recent years from spending time in Florida, where he, quote, did some work on himself. He seemed lighter, brighter, less dark, and the two became friends again. Susan says she really enjoyed the email exchanges each day between the two of them, so much so that she planned a weekend to DC to visit him. They had a great time in the city, and then later at his apartment, he showed her some of the correspondences he had with incarcerated serial killers. She says she held one of the letters and realized that while she understood this to be fascinating to Bobby, it was a step too dark for her. He wasn't bothered when she shared that. That was a little too dark, but then the two would grow distant from each other again. If you look back at your history once you're old enough, you can see that there are relationships in your life that sort of come in and go out, and it's just, circumstances and life and whatnot. So this is very typical. Okay, so Susan didn't know any of her father's family except for her uncle. So the family lore was that her grandfather had a first family with 3 daughters. We don't know who those people are. And then he had a second family where her father and her uncle were the children. So he had like 2 separate families. And the current survivors of her father's family didn't know anything, which was pretty much her, didn't know anything about this other family. And, genealogy websites were popping up and there were ways to look for relatives. So she decided to look, and she discovered a cousin. So she would receive a reply from a cousin by the name of Karen. Karen said that her grandfather was born at the right time and around the right place, that her mother had passed 5 years before and hadn't really spoken much about her family while she was alive. It was a simple message, the kind you would expect to get through a genealogy site. At first, the emails were just between Susan and Karen. Karen mentioned that she had a brother and sister, but she wanted to keep Susan private for right now. Karen, looking for connection and approval from her cousin, totally went along. Fine, that's what you need to do, that's fine. After a few months, Karen disclosed that she had shared Susan's existence with her siblings, and they were excited to meet her. That Christmas, she would receive a Christmas card from her old friend Bobby, who is now living in DC. They reconciled. They bonded over the fact that Bobby had recently started searching for his birth mother. So they were both on these like genealogy quests, and that brought them back together and gave them something else to like chat about every day. It started out little, as these things always do. She received Karen's brother's AOL Instant Messenger ID, which was the rage in 2004. He didn't send anything out because he wanted to make sure that it was okay that he reach out. This is the brother, that he reach out to Susan. And she said, absolutely, I'm looking forward to meeting, any relatives that I have that I don't know. And, but she never heard from him. She seemed a little weird, but whatever. She had the AOL Instant Messenger, and it was kind of like how Google Chat works now. Like you can see who's online, and when they came online, like now it says like who's active, or like there's a green light if they're active. Because back in the day, it was if you were online, like you had to dial up and get online and do all of the stuff while you were online, and then you would get offline. You didn't just like, the internet wasn't just always connected. That's a much more recent thing. So she and Bobby would be chatting on AIM, and they would watch as Leonard's scream name would come up and then go off without ever trying to reach her or connect to her. And they didn't really put much energy into worrying about it. People are weird. Meanwhile, in her exchanges with Karen, the sister was surprised to learn that Leonard had not reached out yet, and she worried out loud that maybe her sister had gotten to him first, which is a really strange thing to write. But Susan wasn't being suspicious at this point. She printed out the email exchanges. You can forward and then reply and forward and forward. And then next thing you know, you forward something to someone that you didn't really mean to forward. Like you didn't mean for all that conversation to be also in the email that you sent, which was what happened when she printed it out, and she saw that there was this whole conversation at the bottom of the email exchange that she hadn't seen, but now she's looking right at it. And it was really, really upsetting to Susan. The sister, Sharon, was berating her sister, Karen, for trusting Susan. She's telling Karen that she's dumb. She doesn't realize that Susan is a con artist who only wants to swindle them out of money. This is not what Susan was looking for. Susan was looking for family connections, not to fracture a happy family. This is not what she had planned. She told Karen that she was not comfortable communicating any longer. That's when Leonard would finally reach out and ask Susan if she wanted to meet for lunch. Now, he lived in New Jersey, so he was the closest one. Meanwhile, she would get a letter, an email, all this is email, from Sharon. And I'm going to read it to you because I don't think I could do it justice. I'm just trying to explain it. So, Dear Susan Fenstein, or whatever you call yourself, this is Sharon, Karen Gardner's sister. What business is it of yours what I say or do concerning my family? You have some nerve reading personal stuff between my sister and me. The polite thing to do would have been to see it wasn't for you and delete it. But I guess you don't know manners. You can stop bothering my family too. My brother said you wrote to him a few times and asked to go to lunch. He has been through enough in his life and does not need to know your type. My sister is very trusting and has a big heart, and people like you always try to take advantage of her. Whatever you are trying to do, it won't work. Now you bother to tell her that you're hurt. That's your own fault for not minding your own business. Sharon. Susan was horrified. First, Leonard had asked her to lunch, not the other way around. And the judgment and vitriol coming from Sharon was just a shock to Susan. Susan would send the following back to Sharon and copy both Karen and Leonard. And I love this. I'm reading it word for word as well. Madam, spare me your vitriol. People search for relatives all the time. Read up on it sometimes. There is no evil plot. Your nasty comments were in an email addressed to me. I printed it out and saw it by accident. Your brother wrote to me asking to meet, not the other way around. Unlike you, I understand that adults can handle their own affairs. I leave you to shadow box with your own paranoia. Susan. Now, Karen would take her sister's side and tell Susan that she couldn't help out at this time. But Susan hadn't asked for any help with anything. She hadn't asked for money. She hadn't asked for nothing. She had literally said, hey, I think we're relatives. Let's get to know each other. And that was it. Okay, but the communications from Karen wouldn't stop. She would ask Susan to apologize to Sharon, and Susan did, but that got her nowhere. She then did something she knows was naive and just not a good choice. And it's one of those things where, like, I totally get why she did it, but I can also, with hindsight being 2020, understand, we can all see that it was a poor choice. So to prove to Karen that she was not someone that Karen needed to fear, Susan let Karen know her address and her phone number. And I get it. I get feeling like you're attacked and someone saying you're this terrible person that you're not at all. And you're like, no, this is who I really am. Here you go. But now she's given basically this whole family access to her phone number and her address. It's not safe. When the Susan describes it, when the olive branch she offered Sharon was returned in pieces, metaphorically speaking, Susan was done. She's going to be done a bunch. She says that the silence that followed was blissful. I cannot tell you how many times in this story she says, and then there was silence, and it was blissful. It was wonderful. But the silence never lasted, ever. It just didn't. So it's not long after, and she's chatting with Bobby on, AIM, the AOL Instant Messenger, and they would see Leonard log on and log off and hardly taking note until Susan started to receive all kinds of porn notifications and emails, like one more depraved than the next. And a pattern emerged. Leonard would sign on to AIM. Susan would receive 10 to 15 emails from these crazy porn sites, addresses written to her own name, to a version of her name, sometimes just to shit, like dear shit. Then the emails would cease as soon as he signed off. Okay, so again, remember, this is when you have to go online, okay? Like, you're not just, like I said before, you're not just living online, you have to go online. There was very little always online access at this point. T1 lines were becoming a thing that gamers and hackers used, but the rest of us just used dial-up. So it became clear that Leonard had a fixation on Susan, and it wasn't a good fixation. Is it ever a good fixation? I feel like if it's fixation or obsession, like, it's not healthy. The more you know. She could see that he was obsessed with her and sexually interested in her. Gross. Her cousin. This terrified both her and Bobby. Bobby set to explaining to Susan how IP addresses worked, but narrowing down who specifically sent an email was usually just too large of a task. She and Bobby wrote a complaint to AOL, but of course they never heard back. And the porn was now coming in daily and not just in the evenings. So out of the blue, Susan would receive an email from Karen. Why she opened it, she said she was going to delete them, but I probably would have opened it too. Curiosity killed the cat. But as Stephen King taught us, satisfaction brought it back. Karen would say that she wanted to meet Susan while she was in New York. Her husband was going to New York for a convention. She was going to join. And Susan sort of hesitantly agreed, but that they could meet for, lunch in the city. But Karen would cancel the day before due to an ill child. Meanwhile, the emails are still coming in all day now, and Susan sent another complaint to AOL, after which she got an email from Leonard. You like to complain. I can make you moan, too. Ew! That's when ads in Susan's name started to appear on kink and fetish sites. For instance, New York female, age 41, seeking kinky woman, seeking kinky man, seeking kinky couples, seeking kinky lesbian couples, seeking kinky group sex, 3 or more, seeking kinky swingers. If you've seen some of my other videos, there's no kink shaming here. None. As long as everyone is agreed, everyone's an adult, everyone's consenting, have at it. Seriously, do whatever it is that makes, you enjoy life. But to do this in someone else's name just as a form of harassment is not okay. Sharon would file a police report in Boston, Sharon, the sister, in Boston, accusing Susan of prostitution. She reached out to genealogy.com and reported Susan as a con artist. And late night phone calls had begun, hang-ups mostly, or Susan just wouldn't answer. I mean, who's calling her at 1 o'clock in the morning? Her life was becoming beyond stressful. The situation was completely taking over her life. Karen would then reach out to Susan because she was always the last to know everything in the family, and she felt like things were going on that she didn't know about. Susan forwarded the emails and shared the porn ads and told Karen about the calls, but after that, Susan got an attachment sent to her from a Yahoo account whose name was clearly a take on her own. She didn't want to see it, so she forwarded it to Bobby, who said that it was her head superimposed onto a porn star's body. After this, Susan told Karen she was changing her email address and she was no longer interested in any communications from anyone in this family. And then there was more blissful silence. And then Susan heard from someone new. Hal. Yeah, you might want to take out a pen and paper to take notes on who all these characters are, because there's going to be a lot more. So Hal is Karen's husband. He seems to be far more level-headed than anyone else Susan has dealt with in this whole mess. He tells Susan that Karen was in the hospital recovering, and that Leonard was in a place called Greystone where they, quote, knew him well. Susan Googled Greystone, discovered that while it had been a state of the art when it was created, it had long since descended into disrepair. The place looked like it should have been condemned, but it still ran. It housed mostly extreme sexual predators, information that, of course, caused Susan to worry and stress even more. And then the situation leveled up. Karen told Susan that Sharon was blaming Susan for her fiancé postponing their wedding. It seems the fiancé didn't realize how nutty Sharon was until she saw her reaction to the situation with Susan, which in turn caused Susan, who was clearly mentally unstable, to blame Susan for the lost deposit money, the loss of a father for her 2 kids, and the loss of her love as well. And Sharon would waste no time in spewing forth the usual threats and condemnations towards Susan. She told Susan she was a homewrecker, she had destroyed her future, and she, quote, said, "I hope you die in a burning hell." And then she says, "You don't know who you're dealing with." Susan didn't reply. She knew she wouldn't get anywhere. But I can't. I mean, it's just chilling. I hope you die in a burning hell? Okay, Susan is a warrior for making it to the other side of this insanity. A warrior. Now corresponding with Hal, Susan was told that Leonard was on 3 times the normal amount of meds, and he was only calm when he was working on a painting that Susan knew was of her. Next, she found out that Karen had suffered 3rd-degree burns on her legs when her sister punched her in the face while she was carrying a pot of boiling water. The punch was earned because Karen mentioned that she was planning on meeting Susan when she was in New York City. This email would drop other tidbits of information. Something about a Burr situation and a Belarus thing about how Leonard seemed to get into trouble, but then he'd get right out of it again. It was never his fault. He was always just in the wrong place at the wrong time. Bobby would suggest that they try to figure out what those 2 hints meant. Okay? The Burr situation and the Belarus thing. So Bobby started doing some research, and he tracked down the offender page for a convict named Lou Burr. It was on the the New Jersey Department of Corrections website. Burr had been convicted of kidnapping, rape, and weapons possession in 1986. He had forced an underage girl off the street at knife point and SA'd her. He'd served 13 years, had been paroled, and then sent back to prison in 1999 for parole violation. Burr's profile and the details of his crime were also on the website of New Jersey's registered sex offenders. His alias was Lou, and his New Jersey Department of Corrections photograph showed a disturbing, dead-eyed predator staring from the screen. He was currently free and categorized as a Tier 2 moderate offender. The designation meant that he was assessed as a possible reactivist and a threat to public safety. What had Leonard been involved in? All Bobby could find on the Belarus situation was a news story that was linked to stories of child sex trafficking. A CNN story from a few weeks earlier reported a federal bust involving dozens of people in New Jersey in a New Jersey child pornography sting. So R word, kidnapping, weapons assaults, child sex trafficking, child pornography. He's been involved in some very, very scary things. Because Susan is no stranger to trauma. She found herself actually sympathetic towards the family when she found out more about what they had suffered through. Mental illness is a very difficult thing to deal with, and she knew from personal experience. She knew that support was what the members of this family, like Karen and Hal, needed, which is just shows what a wonderful human Susan is. But that they pulled at her sympathy, at her sympathy strings and pulled at her personal experiences, and it's just such manipulation. Okay, so Karen would dump a bunch more information on Karen, and I'm just gonna go through it in short bursts. Again, I'm saying this is a very broad stroke version of the story. So, okay, first she would say that they had a baby sister. That Leonard had been caught playing with matches. The next day, half of the house had burned to the ground with their baby sister inside. Their mom never treated Leonard the same again. When he was 12, he was caught by a neighbor looking in his daughter's window while she undressed. Leonard, surprised by being caught, grabbed a nearby shovel and hit the man in the head, but he would survive. Thank goodness. Sorry, the rolling the eyes was not at the fact that the man survived. It was the fact that, so he survived, so what, she doesn't get in any trouble for doing that? Because the guy was okay. He spent time in an institution during his teen years. One stay was for over a year. The Burr situation was that a woman fled in the middle of the night, injured and half clothed, from an apartment that Leonard was inside of. There was no evidence to include Leonard in the crime. There were two other men there. Only one would serve time, as he was the only one whose DNA was found on the victim. So at some point in his 20s, late 20s, early 30s, his meds got figured out. And he started working on Wall Street and doing a really good job. He was doing really, he's very intelligent. He was doing a really good job, and he met a woman and they fell in love and they got married and they got pregnant and they had the baby. But the marriage would only last until their baby died of what the authorities think was SIDS. The death ruined the marriage. Leonard would be sent back to an institution, and his wife would file for divorce the moment he got out. He went missing for a year and a half until found wandering around a neighborhood. He didn't know who he was or where he was. He had been off his meds. So they managed to get him back on his meds. And Karen thought that everything was going well until all of this started with Susan. And if all that information isn't upsetting enough, Karen would tell Susan that he was getting out of Greystone in a few weeks. And then if he approached her to please not call the police, to smile, to be nice, he responds really well to that. To contact Gracie at this number at Greystone, but please, don't call the authorities. So now she's being told to just be nice to a man who has threatened and harassed her. This letter scares the shit out of her. She shows it to her then boyfriend, Nolan. He wanted the whole thing over, or at least he didn't really want to hear about it anymore. So Susan ended up reaching out to Bobby, who was far more understanding. He'd been her rock through all this, to discuss the information dump that was Karen's latest letter. Bobby would also locate information about the other offender with Burr that night. The other offender that night was Robert McCautry, who had an alter ego by the name of Felix. Burr and McCautry had both been convicted of R-word in New Jersey. They had done time there and were now out. If Leonard was in contact with them, then Susan was probably in really, really, really terrible danger. So Karen would then warn her that Sharon was going to New York City. And so for that entire time that Sharon was supposedly in New York, Susan would be terrified to even leave her apartment. The psychological torment of this situation is just awful. When she got a threatening letter from the sister of Sharon's ex-fiance. Sorry. I'm not laughing because it's funny. I'm laughing because it is just so uncomfortable. So the madness is now spilling over into other families. Susan doesn't have the energy to engage fully with peripheral members of this story. She's already chilled to the bones that Sharon or Leonard might show up on her street at any moment. She has started to change her appearance when she left her apartment. She looked at every single person she passed on the street with suspicion. Susan had a dog, and she called him Mini-Me, who was part shepherd, part pit bull, part Doberman, I believe. She got him a spiked leather collar to make him look tougher. I cannot tell you how glad I am that she had a dog. All single women, especially in big cities, should have dogs. Big, scary ones that are totally loyal to them. But I digress. So she's, at this point, completely all consumed by the situation. It's eating away at her. It's making her unhealthy, right? I mean, to live in stress like that is not healthy. The threats in the emails from Sharon were terrifying. For instance, she didn't mind if her brother went away for the rest of his life as long as he took care of Susan. Sharon also seemed to know things. There's a picture of Susan online with her two dogs, and Sharon says something about how, I know one of your dogs is dead, and that's probably due to the fact that dogs simply don't live as long as we'd like them to. When Susan would hear from Karen about a family fight that somehow centered around Susan, the painting that we had heard about before really was of her, and Sharon had ruined it, and Leonard had run off, and they didn't know where he was. So they have no idea where Leonard is. And Sharon is even more angry. So now there are literally threats to her life and an unhinged man who's obsessed with her that is missing. Susan realized at this point that she had lost a lot of weight, and she was visibly trembling with fear and exhaustion and weakness. And she sat down at her computer to read the new messages, and her hand had a hard time steadying on the mouse. That is how traumatized she was by this, how hurt by this whole situation, how it was just eating away at her. And of course, at this point, they step it up another notch. So guess who's now getting strange phone calls? Nolan, her boyfriend. So Susan tries, she's like, okay, now this is not just messing with me. This is messing with my boyfriend. I need to call the authorities. At the police station, Susan said that she wanted to file a sexual harassment complaint against her cousin Leonard. She showed them the pictures he'd drawn and sent her, but they were deemed not pornographic. The female officer helping her looked at her like she wished there was more she could do. Going to the police and filing the complaint made Susan actually feel worse. She and Leonard were now intertwined, connected legally, forever. The move was supposed to make her feel better, but damn, it did not. When she called Bobby, she could hear James, Bobby's boyfriend, in the background fretting. She describes them as her two gay grandmothers, always worrying about her, always fretting. She would fill them in, and Bobby assured her that she did the right thing in going to the police. At this point, Bobby would say, you need to check out Leonard's new profile picture. The profile picture is very disturbing. Again, for all these really, really intense details, listen to the podcast or read the book if you can, but listen to the podcast. It's just going to give you way more information than this. But Susan was done. She pulled up stakes and got the hell out of Dodge. She canceled her internet service. She signed up for something different. She set her phone to not let any anonymous or no caller ID calls come through. She let her Yahoo address fill up until it reached capacity and started sending undeliverable messages in response to emails. She vowed never to use her real name in an email ever again. So at this point, she would hear from a friend who had tried to find her once her email address was shut down and had gotten a hold of someone who ended up impersonating Susan until this friend knew the messages could not be coming from Susan, which is why he ended up phoning her. He never phoned her. They were pen pals. And it was, it had gone to email, and I'm sure she was just so frazzled when she stopped her email. She didn't send to this particular, pen pal. And when this friend called her and said, "Why are you responding to me in such crazy ways?" She was like, "Yeah, that's not me." So she would clear up the confusion with her friend, but now there's another level of worry, because he had reached out to somebody and they had said, "Yes, I'm Susan." And it was when they started being sort of sexually interested or being sort of inappropriate in that way in their communications, he was like, "This is not like you. Who am I talking to? Like, what is going on?" Which is why he called, which is great. That's a great friend who was like, "Wait a minute. I don't think this is you." She would get communications from someone who called himself Bob from an email address with the name of Felix in it. And she knew that this had to be the other perp from the 86 crime, McCautry. He knew too much about her and was way too friendly when she and Bobby decided to forward the email to Leonard and politely ask that he keep her email private. After that, she would get a threatening email from McCautry, followed by information from Hal that he had to head to New Jersey to help Leonard because his friend Bob had gone missing. Did Leonard do something to Bob? Because he was rude to So Susan's emotions are being manipulated into every different direction. I do not know how she kept it together. I mean, she'll tell you that she didn't, but she did. She was a warrior. She is a warrior, that she kept her head in all of this somehow, that she was able to keep all this information straight. I mean, it's just, okay. So now we've gotten to a point in the story where she gets invited to a party that Leonard is going to throw, and it's called Kink Fest. And it's actually his alter ego, Leora, would be throwing it. Again, if you want to know about Leora and the weird profile picture and the alter ego, you're really going to have to listen to the podcast. This thing is going to be, my version of it's going to be too long as it is. So she got invited, and she was actually considering going. She really wanted to meet Leonard. She wanted to put a face to this situation, But when she heard from other attendees, she knew attending was a bad idea, and she was definitely not going to go. She would hear from someone who calls himself Master Mulgrave, and his girlfriend Cyrese. They invited her to join them to the party, as they also lived in Brooklyn, so they could give her a ride. They sent along a picture, and Susan describes them as goth. He's in all black with a top hat. She's in a red dress with white kabuki-style makeup on. They have a real sub-dom feeling going on about them. Without even responding to Mulgrave's email, Susan would get a threatening email from Cyrese, making sure that Susan knew that Mulgrave, Mr. Master Mulgrave, whatever, was hers, and Susan shouldn't touch him. She shouldn't even look in his direction. Susan started getting emails from people who seemed to think that she was interested in the lifestyle, and she would get demanding emails from talking to her as if she was already a sub. "Hello, slave. This is what you must do." I'm like, "No, I'm not doing these things." Tell Leonard that she was not attending and to please leave her off any future information on the subject. And Susan would then hear from someone named Carl. It was Mulgrave, but it's not Master Mulgrave anymore. It's Carl. He's worried about her because Cyrese's uncle happens to be McCautry, the one who's missing. Only he's not missing anymore. He was found, and he was put back into Greystone. and she's pissed, and she's blaming Susan. So Susan started receiving information that was forwarded from Carl or from Leonard or others, but the information contained within was basically a plot to kidnap Susan and Nolan, sell them to a cult upstate, a cult called the 12 Tribes cult, which did indeed live and work out of upstate New York and had some very upsetting litigation against them. The plan they had was that Nolan would be sent to work in the fields, and, he could just work with a bit in his mouth if he gave them a hard time. And that Susan would easily become a breeder. She would give them a baby every year until she was used up, and then they could feast on her flesh. I can't. What? Oh my God. What? So, without her knowledge, her boyfriend Nolan would call the FBI and get an appointment. Props to Nolan. Well done. Nolan gets a big old well done for that one. So it's great. The way she describes the FBI headquarters building is great. I probably don't have room for these details, but they're so cool. She talks about how she and Nolan, first of all, they had to get welcome, let into the building, right? And then they're completely checked. Their IDs are checked. Everything on them is checked, and they go through the metal, detectors and whatnot. And then they're escorted to the elevator. And then they're escorted onto the elevator. And when they get to the floor that they're going to, the person who is escorting them on the elevator hands them over to someone on that floor. And the person on that floor would take them to the room where their appointment would be held. Like, this is for real. This is the FBI. Like, they're not messing around. They're not joking. They're not kidding. This is some serious stuff. So Susan says that after waiting for a very long time, and she would have waited however long it took, she describes a young, handsome, professional, immaculate FBI agent by the name of Brandon Waller. Agent Waller would listen respectfully to everything that Susan would say. He was impressed with her binder of emails and information. He told her that he had heard of the 12 Tribes cult, but he had never heard that they were involved with any cannibalism in any way. But Susan says that for the first time, she felt heard. The first time in the entire scenario, she felt heard by an authority figure. She felt she at least had someone's ear. Agent Waller reports that he didn't believe that this case had any merit. He wanted to look into it, figure out it was nothing, and put it to bed, so to speak. But when he investigated, the leads would lead to actual people or actual events. He expressed that he really wanted to be done with this case, but because he clearly has a lot of integrity and he's going to do his due diligence, he kept running into real life information. He explains that when stories like this come to the FBI, the usual way that it is handled is that someone comes in, a person would come in, they'd explain their situation, realize the FBI isn't playing around and not contact them again, right? But Susan was persistent. And Agent Waller knew that someone who pushed as hard as Susan did was not making this up. It was perfectly clear to him that she was truly being terrorized and that this situation had affected her life, livelihood, mental health, and relationships. Agent Waller was taking this situation seriously. He reports that he first looked in to see if he could find some of the characters in the story. He looked up Robert McCautry, Carl Mulgrave, Blue Burr. He found Robert McCautry in a federal prison where he had been since the early 1990s. He didn't know what a cell phone was. He certainly didn't know what the internet was. And he looked at Agent Waller like he was a complete idiot. How could I have done any of this? I have been right here in prison since 1991. And of course, the agent would do his research. No, he was never paroled. No, he's absolutely been here. They never lost him. There's no way he could have done this. He was in jail. He would find Lou Burr, who had died years ago in a car accident. He found Hal, but he was an older gentleman living in Boston. He had no idea who any of these people were or any of these crazy conversations. In fact, the agent says he sounded really worried because he's a banker and he thought maybe it was like a white collar thing, but that's not what it was. So at this point, the story is starting to unravel, right? When Bobby was told that these people didn't really seem to be real, he pushed back, which is what he always did. He was her devil's advocate. Between the two of them, they would, their theories and whatnot. But he said, like, how can they not be real? They have lives, they have histories. There's too much information for all, real information for all of it to be made up. Bobby speculated that Susan had been dropped by the feds. He told her that this handsome agent that she always seemed to be drooling over had told his boss about the case, and his boss had told him to drop it because the FBI doesn't have the time or the money to worry about stupid cases like this. Susan was used to Bobby pushing back in, like a devil's advocate kind of way, like I said. But this was more hostile than even she was used to. She tried to step back from the friendship. Agent Waller had discovered that the lawsuit suit in Boston was completely fabricated. The judge who had been on the paperwork had been in retirement for years. The DA was horrified to see her name on mocked up paperwork because the whole thing was fake. None of it was real. Karen, Sharon, Leonard, Carl, Bob, Cyrese, Lydia, the myriad of other characters, they simply weren't real. Like, there may have been people that had their names and maybe had their rap sheets, but that was it. They weren't actually involved in this situation at all. Over the next few months, Susan would get periodic updates from Agent Waller, as well as continued banter back and forth with Bobby about how this, how could this all be made up, and if it really was, and, they're just sort of working through it. So spring of that year, while at work, Susan watched as she got notification after notification after notification of, your e-card has been sent, your e-card has been sent, your e-card has been read, your e-card has been read, your e-card has been read, to all of her work colleagues, and she knew it was bad. And so she opened the top one because she had to know what it was that she was sending, or not she, but someone pretending to be her was sending to her work colleagues. And it was an e-card that had like a donkey on the cover or something, and the message was, I'm bored. I don't really like my job. My mind is on other things, like sex. If you want to get together later, email me, Susan F. Now, her boss luckily knew a little bit about what was going on, and the people she worked with knew that this couldn't possibly be coming from her, but it was too much. This is her livelihood. This is her career. This is her, like how she lives her life. So she would forward all of this information to Agent Waller, and this would end up being the break they needed. She describes getting home and hearing the phone ring and running to get it. At one point, the agent says, she didn't have a cell phone, so I was just leaving messages on her apartment phone. And she would see that the caller ID was at Agent Waller, so she picked up. And Agent Waller would ask her, do you have any friends, or do you know anyone who lives in the DC area? And she did. She knew two people. Her friend Bobby and his boyfriend James. Her friend Bobby. Agent Waller asked for his full name, for his address, for his apartment number, for his phone number. And Susan was in shock. The agent told her that he would really like to meet with her and talk to her, 45 minutes an hour, that he's bringing another agent, and is there a place that we could go, have a cup of coffee and talk about some things. Before they hung up, he said, do you have a picture of Bobby? Can you print it out? Can you bring it? So she did. So she met them. She handed over the picture, and Agent Waller took out a big red marker and put an arrow directly to his head. Agent Waller and Agent Good would ask Susan about Bobby. Where did he work? He'd never really had much in the way of steady employment. Mostly, Susan knew him to be a hustler. When she first met him, a priest was paying for his apartment. Bobby had told Susan that this priest had SA'd him as a child, but that he didn't describe it as trauma. He described it as something he enjoyed. This priest was now paying for his life. They also wanted to know about James. So Susan told them that he's the responsible one. He's the hard worker. He's the one who's paying for both of their lives. At this point, she would share that Bobby had a collection of correspondence with serial killers. And by the time the conversation was coming to a close, the at first gruff Agent Good had softened, and both agents were expressing wanting to get Bobby and get him good. It was clear to both agents that the manipulation and gaslighting happening to her was all too real, and they were both disgusted that someone who said they were Susan's friend had perpetuated the entire thing. They said they weren't sure where the case was going to go from here, but that Susan should try to behave as normally as possible with Bobby to keep suspicions low. Bobby would notice that she was different, but she did her best to blame it like on the situation. Like, I'm just stressed out and this is just, it's awful and I wish I knew, she tried to blame it on that. So the next time she reached out to Agent Waller, he would say, I'm actually in DC and I'm getting ready to carry out a search and seizure warrant at Bobby's apartment. Oh, this is like real. So, and like I said in the podcast, you actually hear the agent speaking. Like, he gives you his firsthand account, and he explains the situation. He says that they had Susan draw a diagram of the apartment so they wouldn't have any surprises. They wanted to know where, the closet doors were in every room, and, so there wouldn't be any surprises. They went in, they removed the computers, disks, papers, correspondence, anything they could find that could be useful, could have evidence on it that could help them. Now, they were not arresting anyone. This was just about a collection of evidence. So as the warrant was being served, Agent Waller says that he took Bobby up to the roof of the apartment building so the two of them could have a little chat away from the chaos below. And the agent says, he was clearly trying to get over on him and trying, to get himself out of it. So he denied most of it. He denied he was any part of it, and then he would put everything on her, on the victim, which for future reference is not a really good idea to blame the victim. He told Agent Waller that Susan was a drug user and had family problems. Agent Waller says that while Bobby thought that he was smarter than them, this is great. The agent says, I think he thought he was smarter than me, and maybe he was, but the thing is, we had evidence. It's great the way he says it. So putting the blame on her just convinced the agents that they have the guy who's been doing it. Many of the pictures that had been sent to her were found on his computer, proving the origin of the photos. Bobby would then call the FBI office in Washington to speak with Agent Waller before he left to go back to New York. He says he wanted to clear some things up, and he came in and he spoke with the agent. He walked back his I don't know anything and said that he had reached out to these people to try to get them to back off her, to try to help her, but never told anyone that he'd done so. And that's really all his involvement. So a few days later, Susan would get a typed letter from Bobby apologizing for his involvement in the whole mess. And he regretted reaching out to the creeps. But at this point, Susan knew full well Bobby was the creeps. Reached out to them, you were them. Turns out, the dumbest thing that Bobby did, and I don't like using the word dumb or stupid or what have you, but this is just dumb. Turns out that Bobby sent a letter via fax to Agent Waller in New York, to the New York office. The letter was, he says, about 4 or 5 pages long, and the agent was shocked that this person would actually write and then send something like this. He admitted to being involved, but still put a lot of blame on Susan. He was actually trying to help her and make her stronger. Oh, he's spoken to the FBI twice and sent them a letter, and none of the information on those 3 communications match. None of it, which means that Bobby has provided false information to a U.S. federal agent. And as the agent says, it might not be the charge you want, but it's something we can charge him with. You're not allowed to lie to the FBI. Certainly not in writing. I mean, you're really not. Like, it's against big laws. Guess what? Bobby was arrested, and he was brought to court to be arraigned. Susan attended the hearing. When Bobby was standing at the defense table facing the judge, he put his 2 hands behind his back, and he gave Susan the finger so that everyone in the courtroom besides the judge could see. Bobby pleaded guilty, and sentencing was scheduled for a month later. It would actually end up being detained because of the judge's health, so it was actually 6 months later when Bobby was back in court. Susan says that this was so hard to, it was just dragging it out and like, just get this over with. I mean, this starts in 2003, 2004, and the sentencing happens in 2007. So this is not a short situation. For the sentencing, Susan had written an a victim impact statement, but had decided not to speak. Agent Waller had suggested that she speak, but because it can be a really great way for victims to get some of their power back. But she was she got there just as it started, and she sat in the back, and she just, was watching. And part of a guilty plea is that you have to describe the crime you could, so elocution, I believe it's called. While Bobby was explaining that he could never have done this. He could never have done what he'd done if Susan had never written him back. The judge pushed him on the point. I'm sorry, what do you mean? Finally, Bobby said, well, I wouldn't have been able to do any of this if she wasn't a willing participant. Excuse me? As the federal prosecutor says, so it's the bank's fault for having cash, not the robber's fault for stealing the money? I mean, the bank was there. They must be a willing participant if I was allowed to. What? The judge is clearly taken aback by what he has said. And Susan raises her hand and asks to speak. So she starts by saying, I wasn't planning on speaking, but I really need to address this willing participant comment. She spoke eloquently and explained clearly that she was harassed to the point of exhaustion and terrorized by fear, and she was in no way willing to be part of that. So at this point in our legal history, judges were sentencing criminals at sort of the low end of the punishment spectrum, especially for stuff like this. So Susan had no hope of jail time, but she was hoping that he could be on parole so that he would know that he couldn't mess up again, that if he did one more thing. That's the whole thing about parole. It's like you got to be on your best behavior. So, and she liked the idea of the authorities knowing where he was at all times, and that if he did something or he crossed the line, there was someone she could go to in there. After she spoke, she sat down. And the judge said to the Bobby, do you have anything else to say? And he says something really obnoxious, like, Miss Fenstein and I both know what really happened. But then he says, I think I should probably just stop talking. It'd probably be better if I just don't talk anymore. Yeah, you should have done that a long time ago. The judge, who is older, and he questioned him at one time and said, so if she had never picked up the phone, you would never have been able to harass her. And the Bobby says, there was no phone involved. So he's trying to say to this judge, he doesn't really know what he's talking about. This judge knows exactly what he's talking about. He listened, he heard, and he sentenced Bobby to 3 months in jail. Everyone involved, everyone said if he had just kept his mouth shut, he wouldn't be in jail. He wouldn't be going to jail. If he hadn't sent that fax, if he hadn't called her willing participant, if he had just used his right to remain silent, he would never have served any jail time. Susan reports that after the court was dismissed, Bobby was allowed to surrender himself in 4 weeks' time. So she was waiting for the elevator, and Bobby headed towards her and lunged at her. James was able to grab him before he got his hands on Susan, but dear God, what if he had? What would he have done? A little part of me kind of wishes that he had, and then he wouldn't have been in jail for longer, but I don't want her to get hurt in any way. To even be touched by this guy is horrifying. So Susan says that even now, 20 years later, she's still frightened of Bobby. And one of the reasons she's putting her story out there is to get some power back. The fact that the FBI agent and the federal prosecutor were given permission to be interviewed for a podcast is quite remarkable. Susan credits Agent Waller with saving her life, both literally and figuratively. And of course, Agent Waller credits Susan for being her own advocate. Apparently, every few years, Susan hears from Agent Waller, who's just checking in to see how she's doing. Now, please, I beg of you, go listen to the podcast. It's amazing. And I will check you next time. Bye.